During the division of my late husband's assets, my son whispered, "No need to leave her anything, she's already 1 foot in the grave." I just smiled. A week later, he was notified as delinquent. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would come from my own son. Whispered in a lawyer's office while dividing my deceased husband's assets. The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a chasm. Gary sat across from me, his perfectly pressed suit making him look every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. His wife Sandra perched beside him, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against her designer purse. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, shuffled through documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had witnessed countless family disputes. "Now, regarding the primary residence," Mr. Peterson began, adjusting his glasses, "the property is valued at $450,000. According to the will, it goes entirely to Mrs. Morrison." I watched Gary's jaw tighten. He had been expecting a different outcome, that much was clear. For months leading up to this meeting, he had been dropping hints about how the house was too much for me to handle alone, how I should consider my options and think practically about the future. "What about the other properties?" Sandra interjected, her voice sharp with barely concealed impatience. "The rental units downtown?" Mr. Peterson flipped to another page. "Those also go to Mrs. Morrison, along with the majority of the investment portfolio and savings accounts." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Gary calculating in his head, watching his inheritance shrink before his eyes. This was not the meeting he had envisioned. "Dad always was sentimental about Mom," Gary finally said, his tone suggesting this was somehow a character flaw. "But practically speaking, does she really need all of this at her age?" The words stung, but I remained silent. At 66, I was hardly decrepit, despite what my son seemed to believe. I still drove myself to the grocery store, maintained my garden, and managed my own finances quite capably. But in Gary's mind, I had apparently become a burden, an obstacle standing between him and what he felt was rightfully his. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Morrison, your father was very specific about his wishes. He wanted to ensure your mother was well provided for." Of course," Gary said quickly, realizing how his words sounded. "I just meant that maybe we could restructure things to be more efficient. Mom doesn't need to worry about managing properties and investments. That's a lot of stress for someone her age." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not concern for my well-being. This was calculation. Sandra leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Geraldine, honey, we just want what's best for you. Managing all this must be overwhelming. Maybe we could help you simplify things." Simplify. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, but I still said nothing. Gary nodded eagerly. "Exactly. We could take care of the rental properties, handle the investments. Take that burden off your shoulders. You could focus on enjoying your retirement instead of worrying about all these complicated financial matters." I watched him lean back in his chair, confident that he was presenting a reasonable solution. But I knew my son. I had raised him after all. This was not about helping me. This was about helping himself. The meeting continued for another hour, with Gary and Sandra making increasingly transparent attempts to convince me to reconsider the arrangement. They painted pictures of me struggling alone in the big house, overwhelmed by financial responsibilities, isolated and vulnerable. As we prepared to leave, Gary gathered his papers and leaned close to Mr. Peterson. He thought he was whispering, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet room. "Look, between you and me, she doesn't need all this. She's already got 1 foot in the grave anyway. No point leaving everything tied up when it could be put to better use." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands trembling as I reached for my purse. Gary had not just dismissed my needs or my capabilities. He had written me off entirely. In his mind, I was already dead, just an inconvenience preventing him from accessing what he believed was his birthright. Mr. Peterson's face went pale. Sandra looked mortified, though whether from embarrassment or fear of being caught, I could not tell. Gary himself seemed oblivious to the impact of his words, already mentally spending money that was not his. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. "I think we're finished here for today. I said quietly. Mom, wait, Gary called after me. Finally realizing that something had shifted. I didn't mean. But I was already walking toward the door. I had heard enough. More than enough. The drive home passed in a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. Gary's words echoed in my mind, each repetition driving the knife deeper. 1 foot in the grave. As if my death was not just inevitable but convenient. When I reached my house, the house Gary was so eager to help me simplify away, I sat in the driveway for a long time. This was the home Harold and I had built together over 37 years of marriage. Every room held memories of our life together, of raising Gary, of countless holidays and celebrations. Gary had grown up in this house. I had nursed him through childhood illnesses in the upstairs bedroom. I had helped him with homework at the kitchen table. I had celebrated his graduation, his wedding, every milestone of his life within these walls. And now he saw it as nothing more than an asset to be liquidated, with me as the inconvenient obstacle in his way. I thought about Harold, about how he would have reacted to Gary's words today. My husband had always been more skeptical of our son's motives than I was. Geraldine, he would say during Gary's frequent requests for financial help, you can't keep enabling him. He needs to learn to stand on his own. But I had always defended Gary. He was our only child and I wanted to believe the best of him. Every loan that was never repaid, every crisis that required our intervention, every time he treated our generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift, I had made excuses for all of it. Now, sitting alone in my car, I realized that Harold had been right. I had not raised a son. I had raised a vulture, circling and waiting for his chance to feed. But Gary had made one crucial mistake today. He had shown me exactly how little he thought of me, and in doing so, he had freed me from any obligation to consider his feelings in return. That night I could not sleep. Gary's words replayed in my mind like a broken record, each repetition bringing fresh pain. I found myself wandering through the house, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own motherhood. In Gary's old bedroom, now my sewing room, I stopped at the bookshelf where I still kept his childhood photos. There he was at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing he had made for Mother's Day. I love you more than ice cream, the crayon letters declared in his unsteady handwriting. When had that little boy become the man who casually dismissed my life as already over? I pulled out the photo album I had been avoiding since Harold's funeral and settled into my reading chair. Page after page chronicled Gary's life, but as I looked at them now, I began to see patterns I had missed before. There was Gary at 8, arms crossed and pouting because I had said no to buying him an expensive toy at the store. Harold had wanted to teach him about earning money through chores, but I had given in later that week, unable to bear his sulking. Gary at 12, scowling in his graduation photo because the bicycle I had bought him was not the exact model his friend had. I had returned it and bought the more expensive one he wanted, dipping into our vacation fund to make it happen. Gary at 16, refusing to speak to me for a week because I had grounded him for staying out past curfew. Harold had supported the punishment, but I had lifted it early because I could not stand the silent treatment. The pattern was there in every photo, every memory. Gary's disappointment when he did not get his way. My immediate capitulation to restore peace. Harold's increasing frustration with both of us. You're creating a monster, Geraldine, Harold had said after one particularly dramatic episode when Gary was 17. He had wrecked his car racing with friends and demanded we buy him a new one immediately, claiming he needed it for his job at the grocery store. He's just young, I had defended him. He'll grow out of it. Harold had shaken his head. No, he won't. Not if you keep rescuing him from every consequence. But I had bought Gary the car anyway. I had told myself it was because he needed it for work, but the truth was simpler and more damaging. I could not bear for my son to be unhappy with me. The pattern had continued into his adulthood, growing more expensive and more destructive with each passing year. When Gary graduated college, he moved back home temporarily, while he looked for a job in his field. Temporarily became 8 months of him sleeping until noon, going out with friends every night, and treating our house like a hotel. When Harold finally gave him an ultimatum about finding work, I had quietly been slipping Gary spending money so he would not feel pressured. When he finally moved out, it was because I had found him an apartment and paid the first 6 months of rent as a graduation gift. When Gary married Sandra, I had paid for half the wedding because they wanted something memorable. The $25,000 came from our retirement savings, money Harold and I had planned to use for a trip to Europe we had been dreaming about for years. "We can travel later," I had told Harold when he protested. "This is our son's wedding. It's important." We never took that trip. Harold's health began declining 2 years later, and travel became impossible. When Gary and Sandra bought their first house, they had come to us for help with the down payment. "It's an investment," Gary had explained. "You're helping us build equity. We'll pay you back once we get established." We had given them $30,000. They had never mentioned paying it back again. When Gary's business ventures failed, and there had been several over the years, we had covered his losses. When Sandra quit her job to focus on herself, we had helped with their mortgage payments. When they decided to renovate their kitchen, I had quietly transferred money into their account so Sandra could have the granite countertops she insisted were necessary. Each time Harold had grown more distant, more frustrated. Not with Gary but with me. "You're enabling him," he would say. "You're teaching him that there are no consequences for poor decisions." "I'm helping our son," I would reply. "Isn't that what parents are supposed to do?" But Harold's final years had been marked by a growing coldness between us that I had not understood at the time. He had stopped discussing finances with me, stopped sharing his concerns about Gary's constant demands. I had attributed it to his illness, to the stress of his declining health. Now, sitting in the darkness of my home, I wondered if Harold had been protecting me from a truth I was not ready to face. That our son had never learned to love us for who we were, only for what we could provide. The most painful memory came flooding back as I turned to the last pages of the album. It was from Harold's final weeks, when he was too weak to leave his bed. Gary had visited exactly twice during those 3 months, once to ask if we had updated our wills, and once to suggest that Harold might be more comfortable in a care facility. "It would be better for Mom too," Gary had said, standing at the foot of his father's bed as if Harold could not hear him. "She's wearing herself out trying to take care of you. A professional facility would be better equipped." Harold's eyes had found mine across the room, and in them I had seen something I had been too afraid to acknowledge: disappointment. Not in Gary but in me. For allowing it to get this far. For choosing Gary's comfort over Harold's dignity. For failing to see what Harold had seen all along. Harold had squeezed my hand that night after Gary left. "I'm sorry," he had whispered. "I should have stopped this years ago. I should have protected you from what he was becoming." I had not understood what he meant then. I thought he was delirious from the medication. But now, as I closed the photo album and prepared to face whatever came next, I finally understood. Harold had not been apologizing for Gary's behavior. He had been apologizing for leaving me alone to deal with the consequences of 30 years of misguided love. He had known that Gary would come for everything once he was gone, and he had known that I would not be strong enough to stop him. But Harold had been wrong about one thing. Sitting there in the darkness, Gary's cruel words still echoing in my mind, I discovered something I had not known I possessed. The strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. The morning after the lawyers' meeting, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years. Gary's words had done something unexpected. They had freed me from the burden of trying to be the mother he wanted me to be. If I was already dead to him, then I could stop living my life according to his expectations. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table where I had solved so many of life's problems over the years. But this time, I was not trying to fix a relationship or smooth over hurt feelings. I was planning a strategy. My first call was to my bank. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison." The manager, Janet, greeted me warmly. "How can I help you today?" "I need to understand all of my accounts," I said. "Everything. I want a complete picture of my financial situation." Janet seemed surprised by the request, but she scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. As I hung up, I realized that for decades, Harold had handled most of our finances. After his death, I had continued making the same automatic transfers, the same payments, without really examining what I was doing or why. It was time to take control. The meeting with Janet was eye-opening. Spread across her desk were statements I had never bothered to examine closely. My checking account showed automatic transfers going out every month, transfers I had set up years ago and forgotten about. This $1,200 that goes out on the 15th of each month. Janet pointed to the statement. That's been running for about 3 years now. I stared at the entry. It was Gary's car payment. I had started paying it when he claimed his business was having a temporary cash flow problem. The temporary problem had apparently lasted 36 months. And this $800 on the first of every month? His health insurance premium. I realized. Gary had asked me to help with it. Just until Sandra found a new job. Sandra had been unemployed for 2 years. What about this $500 quarterly payment? I closed my eyes. His country club membership. Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. Mrs. Morrison, are you aware that these automatic payments total approximately $2,500 per month? $2,500. $30,000 a year. Money that had been flowing out of my account so automatically that I had stopped noticing it was gone. I want to cancel all of these, I said firmly. All of them? Are you sure? Every single one. As Janet processed the cancellations, I thought about the conversation I had overheard Gary having with Sandra in my driveway the week before Harold's funeral. I had been in the kitchen, and they had been standing by their car, thinking I could not hear them. Once Dad's gone, we need to talk to Mom about consolidating everything, Gary had said. She can't handle all this financial stuff on her own. The house alone is worth almost $500,000, Sandra had replied. Plus the rental properties. She doesn't need all that space anyway. Exactly. We could help her find a nice little condo somewhere. Much more manageable. And then what happens to the difference? Gary's laugh had been cold. Well, somebody has to manage her assets. Make sure she's taken care of properly. I had dismissed the conversation at the time, telling myself they were just concerned about my welfare. But combined with Gary's comment at the lawyer's office, their true intentions were crystal clear. After leaving the bank, I drove to a part of town I rarely visited and walked into the office of Patricia Williams, an attorney whose advertisement I had seen in the newspaper. I had deliberately chosen someone Gary would not know. Someone who had no connection to our family's previous legal matters. Patricia was a woman about my own age, with gray hair and kind eyes that sharpened with interest when I explained my situation. Let me understand this correctly, she said, taking notes. Your son expects to inherit most of your assets, and he's been pressuring you to simplify your holdings? He told the lawyer I already have 1 foot in the grave, I said, the words still bitter in my mouth. He seems to think managing my own affairs is beyond my capabilities. Patricia's pen stopped moving. I see. And what would you like to do about this? I want to make sure Gary understands that I'm very much alive and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my money. We spent 2 hours going over my options. Patricia explained trusts, estate planning strategies, and various ways to maintain control over my assets, while making it clear that Gary's expectations were unfounded. The beautiful thing about a revocable trust, Patricia explained, is that you maintain complete control during your lifetime. You can change beneficiaries, alter distributions, even dissolve the entire thing if you want to. But it makes it very clear that these are your decisions to make, not anyone else's. As I drove home that evening, my phone rang. Gary's name appeared on the display, and for the first time in 30 years, I let it go to voicemail. The message was everything I expected. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Sandra and I would like to take you to dinner this weekend, so we can talk more about how we can help you with Dad's estate. There are some time-sensitive decisions that need to be made, and we don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Call me back. Time-sensitive decisions. The urgency in his voice was telling. Gary had probably already made financial commitments based on his expected inheritance. The thought should have worried me, but instead I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The next few days brought a steady stream of calls from Gary, each one more insistent than the last. When I finally answered on Thursday, his relief was palpable. Mom, thank goodness. I was starting to worry something had happened to you. I'm fine, Gary. Just busy. Busy with what? Look, we really need to sit down and go over some of these financial matters. I've been doing some research and there are tax implications we need to consider. The longer we wait, the more complicated things become. I almost laughed. Gary, who had never shown the slightest interest in tax law, had suddenly become an expert on estate planning. What kind of tax implications? I asked. Well, it's complicated. That's why I think we should bring in a professional. I know a financial advisor who specializes in these situations. He could help us restructure everything in the most efficient way. Efficient for whom? There was a pause. For everyone, Mom. For you, for the estate, for the family. I see. And what does Sandra think about all this? Sandra just wants what's best for you. We both do. We hate seeing you struggle with all these complicated decisions on your own. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. I was apparently too fragile, too confused, too incompetent to handle my own affairs. The same woman who had raised him, managed a household for decades, and helped Harold build a successful small business was suddenly incapable of writing a check or reading a bank statement. Gary, I said carefully, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing just fine. Are you? Because I noticed some irregularities in your account activity. Some payments that stopped suddenly. Are you having trouble remembering to pay your bills? My blood went cold. Gary had been monitoring my accounts. Somehow, he had access to information about my banking activity and was tracking my spending. What do you mean irregularities? Nothing serious, Gary said quickly, realizing he had revealed too much. I just happened to notice when I was helping you with some paperwork last month. I set up some account alerts on your phone, remember? Just to help you keep track of things. I did not remember agreeing to any such thing, but I said nothing. Gary continued talking, digging himself deeper with every word. The point is, these financial responsibilities are getting to be too much for you. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Mom. It happens to everyone as they get older. The important thing is recognizing when you need help. And you're offering to help. Of course. That's what family is for. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling violated and furious. Gary had not just been waiting for me to die so he could inherit my money. He had been actively monitoring my finances, probably planning his intervention for months. But his eagerness had revealed something crucial. He was counting on my money for something immediate. The urgency in his voice, the sudden expertise in tax law, the monitoring of my accounts. Gary was not just greedy. He was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Gary wasted no time escalating his campaign. The very next morning, Sandra appeared at my front door with a warm smile and a store-bought coffee cake. I hope you don't mind me dropping by, she said, already stepping past me into the hallway. Gary mentioned you seemed a little overwhelmed lately, and I thought maybe we could have a girl talk. I followed her into my own kitchen, watching as she made herself at home, pulling plates from my cabinet and starting my coffee maker as if she lived there. You know, Geraldine, I've been thinking about what you must be going through, Sandra continued, cutting generous slices of cake. Losing Harold, dealing with all these legal and financial matters. It must feel like drowning sometimes. I sat across from her at my own table, studying her face. Sandra had always been beautiful in an artificial way. Perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, designer clothes that cost more than some people's monthly salary. But this morning, there was something calculating in her expression that she was not quite managing to hide. I'm managing fine, I said quietly. Of course you are, honey. You're incredibly strong. But there's no shame in admitting when something's too much to handle alone. Even the strongest people need help sometimes. Sandra leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Can I tell you something? Gary's been losing sleep worrying about you. He lies awake at night thinking about you all alone in this big house, trying to handle all of Harold's business affairs by yourself. How thoughtful of him. He is thoughtful. Sometimes I think he cares more about your well-being than you do. Sandra's smile flickered slightly. He's been researching senior living communities, you know. Some of them are absolutely beautiful. Like luxury resorts. You'd have people to talk to, activities, no maintenance to worry about. And the healthcare support is right there if you need it. Senior living communities. Don't think of it as giving up your independence. Think of it as upgrading your lifestyle. No more worrying about repairs or yard work or managing tenants in those rental properties. You could actually enjoy your retirement instead of being a slave to all these responsibilities. I took a sip of my coffee, noting how Sandra had neatly summarized all of my assets in her pitch. The house, the rental properties, she had clearly done her homework. And what would happen to my current properties? Sandra's eyes lit up. Well, that's the beauty of it. Gary and I could handle all of that for you. We could manage the rental properties, maintain the house until the market's right to sell it. Take all that stress off your shoulders so you can focus on enjoying yourself. How generous. We're family, Geraldine. That's what family does for each other. I was beginning to understand their strategy. They were not just after my money, they wanted me to voluntarily hand over control of my entire life. The senior living community was not a suggestion. It was a plan they had already made for me. Have you and Gary looked at any of these communities? I asked. Sandra beamed. Actually, yes. There's one about 40 minutes from here that's absolutely perfect. Sunrise Manor. They have a waiting list, but Gary knows someone who might be able to expedite the process if we move quickly. 40 minutes away. Far enough to make spontaneous visits inconvenient, close enough to assuage any guilt they might feel about warehousing me. And they had already researched wait times and connections. This was not a casual suggestion born from concern for my welfare. Would you like to see some brochures? Sandra pulled a folder from her purse. I brought a few just in case you were interested. The brochures were glossy and expensive, filled with photos of smiling seniors playing cards and doing water aerobics. Starting prices began at $4,000 per month for a basic apartment, with additional fees for meals, activities, and various levels of care. $4,000 a month, I murmured. It's an investment in your quality of life, Sandra said quickly. And really, when you consider everything that's included, it's quite reasonable. Plus, you wouldn't have all the expenses of maintaining this house. I did the math in my head. $48,000 a year plus fees. Add the cost of storing my belongings, selling my house below market value in a rush, and liquidating my rental properties to fund this upgrade. And Sandra's plan would drain my assets within 5 years. That was when I understood the timeline they were working with. They did not need me to live long at Sunrise Manor. They just needed me to sign over control of my assets before I realized what was happening. This is a lot to think about, I said, closing the brochures. Sandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course it is. But Geraldine, honey, can I be frank with you? I nodded. Gary's worried about your judgment lately. Little things like forgetting to pay bills, making impulsive financial decisions. He's concerned that if you wait too long to make these kinds of arrangements, you might not be competent to make them at all. The threat was delicately wrapped, but it was unmistakably a threat. If I did not voluntarily agree to their plan, they would find a way to have me declared incompetent. What kind of impulsive financial decisions? I asked. Sandra looked uncomfortable, as if she had said more than she intended. Just some account irregularities, Gary noticed. Payments stopping suddenly, unusual activity. Nothing serious, probably just confusion about automatic payments and things like that. But it's exactly the kind of thing that could become a problem if it gets worse. So Gary had not only been monitoring my accounts, he had been documenting my financial activity to build a case for incompetence. The automatic payments I had canceled were being framed as evidence of mental decline rather than deliberate decisions. I should probably discuss this with Gary directly, I said. Actually, he's hoping to avoid that kind of stressful conversation. You know how emotional these family discussions can get. That's why he asked me to talk to you first, woman to woman. He thought it might be easier for you to hear this from me. Sandra reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gesture reserved for small children and the mentally impaired. We just want what's best for you, Geraldine. We want you to be safe and happy and free from all these burdens that are clearly becoming too much for you to handle. After Sandra left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by her brochures and false concern. The coffee cake sat untouched between us, as artificial as everything else she had brought into my home. I called Patricia Williams immediately. They're moving faster than I expected, I told her. They're already researching facilities and building a case for incompetence. What kind of case? I explained about the canceled automatic payments being framed as confusion, about Gary's access to my accounts, about Sandra's veiled threats regarding my mental competence. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Geraldine, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Is there any truth to their concerns? Are you having any trouble managing your affairs? I'm managing them better than I have in years, I said firmly. I just stopped letting Gary manage them for me. Good. Then we need to move quickly. If they're serious about pursuing competency proceedings, we need to establish a clear record of your mental acuity and decision-making capacity. I'm going to arrange for you to meet with a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in these situations. We'll get a formal evaluation that demonstrates your competence. Is that necessary? If we're going to fight this, we need ammunition. And Geraldine, you should know that if they do try to have you declared incompetent, they'll need evidence of significant impairment. The fact that you recognize their manipulation and took steps to protect yourself actually works in your favor. That evening, Gary called. Sandra said she had a nice visit with you today. He began. She mentioned you seemed interested in some of the senior living options. She mentioned a lot of things. Mom, I know this is hard to think about. Nobody wants to admit they're not as young as they used to be. But Sandra's right. Some of these places are really beautiful. And the peace of mind you'd have, knowing that help is right there if you need it. Gary, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you monitoring my bank accounts? The silence that followed was deafening. When Gary finally spoke, his voice was defensive. I'm not monitoring them. I just happened to notice some irregularities when I was helping you with paperwork. What paperwork? Look, Mom, the important thing is that I'm concerned about you. We all are. These little lapses in judgment. Lapses in judgment? Stopping payments suddenly, making decisions without thinking them through. It's exactly the kind of thing Dad would have wanted me to watch out for. The mention of Harold made my chest tight with anger. Don't you dare bring your father into this. Harold would be ashamed of what you're doing. What I'm doing. Mom, I'm trying to help you. No, Gary. You're trying to control me. And if I don't cooperate, you're planning to have me declared incompetent so you can control me anyway. Another long silence. When Gary spoke again, his voice had changed. The false concern was gone, replaced by something colder. Mom, I think you're getting paranoid. That's another concerning symptom. Maybe we should move up the timeline on getting you some professional help. The mask had finally slipped. Gary was no longer pretending this was about my welfare. This was about power, control, and money. And he had just revealed that there was indeed a timeline, a plan already in motion. I have to go, I said. Mom, wait. I hung up and immediately called Patricia. They're accelerating their plan, I told her. We need to move faster. The call came on Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had canceled Gary's automatic payments. I was in my garden, tending to the roses Harold had planted for our 25th anniversary, when my phone rang. Mom! Gary's voice was strained, lacking its usual confident tone. I need to talk to you. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can I come over? It's important. There was something different in his voice, a note of desperation I had never heard before. Of course. I'll put on some coffee. Gary arrived within 20 minutes, which told me he had been nearby, probably working up the courage to make the call. When I opened the door, I was shocked by his appearance. His usually perfectly pressed shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. Gary, what's wrong? You look terrible. He pushed past me into the living room, then turned to face me with wild eyes. Did you stop my car payments? So there it was. The first domino had fallen. Yes, I said simply. Why? Why would you do that without telling me? I sat down in Harold's old chair, taking my time to smooth my skirt before answering. Because it's my money, and I decided I didn't want to pay for your car anymore. Gary stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. But I needed those payments. You can't just stop them without warning. Actually, I can. It's my bank account. Mom, you don't understand. I have other obligations. I counted on those payments. The car could be repossessed if. Then perhaps you should have made arrangements to pay for it yourself. Gary's face flushed red. This isn't like you. Someone's been putting ideas in your head. That lawyer, Peterson, did he tell you to do this? Mr. Peterson had nothing to do with this decision. Then who? Because the mother I know wouldn't just cut off her own son without. The mother you know, I interrupted, has been paying your bills for 30 years while you treated her like a walking bank account. The mother you know just heard her son tell a roomful of people that she already has one foot in the grave. Gary's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I didn't mean. That came out wrong. I was just trying to. You were trying to convince the lawyer that I'm essentially dead, and you should inherit everything immediately. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, Gary? He ran his hands through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled. Look, I'm in a tight spot right now, okay? I made some investments, took on some obligations, and I was counting on. I need help, Mom. Finally, the truth. Gary was not just greedy. He was in trouble. What kind of trouble? Gary collapsed onto my sofa, his head in his hands. I bought a franchise. A restaurant franchise. The guy said it was a sure thing, guaranteed returns, but I needed to put down $50,000. $50,000 you didn't have. I was going to have it. I mean, eventually. From Dad's estate. So I took out a loan against my expected inheritance. My blood ran cold. You borrowed money against inheritance you hadn't received yet? It was supposed to be temporary. Just until we settled Dad's estate. But then all these complications came up. And now the loan payments are due and I can't make them, and you assumed I would bail you out. Gary looked up at me with desperate eyes. You always have before. The simple honesty of that statement hit me like a slap. You always have before. That was how Gary saw our relationship. Not as a mother and son, but as a reliable source of emergency funding. How much do you owe? The loan was for $60,000. With interest and penalties, it's about $75,000 now. $75,000. The payments are $3,000 a month. If I miss another one, they can call the whole loan due immediately. And if I can't pay, his voice trailed off. What happens if you can't pay? They can seize assets. The house, the cars, Sandra's jewelry. Everything. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This explained everything. The urgency, the pressure to liquidate my assets. Sandra's sudden interest in my welfare. They were not planning for my future. They were trying to save themselves from the consequences of Gary's poor decisions. What does Sandra think about all this? Gary's face darkened. Sandra doesn't know the full extent of it. She knows about some of the debt, but not all of it. There's more. I borrowed against the house to invest in cryptocurrency. And I have credit card debt. And I owe money to Sandra's brother for some business deal that went south. My son, the successful businessman I had been so proud of, was drowning in debt from a series of increasingly desperate get-rich-quick schemes. How much total? Gary was quiet for so long I thought he was not going to answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, $140,000. Maybe more. $140,000. No wonder he had been so eager to simplify my estate planning. Gary, I said carefully, when you were pressuring me to restructure my assets, when Sandra was showing me brochures for senior living facilities, were you planning to use my money to pay your debts? He could not meet my eyes. I was going to borrow against your assets. Temporarily. Just until I could get back on my feet. Without telling me. I didn't want to worry you with the details. I was handling it. By stealing from me. It's not stealing. You're my mother. Everything you have is going to be mine eventually anyway. I was just accelerating the timeline. There it was again. That casual assumption that my life, my money, my decisions were all just temporary inconveniences standing between him and what he felt was rightfully his. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 66 years. Gary, I want you to listen to me very carefully. He looked up hopefully, probably expecting me to offer some solution, some way out of the mess he had created. I am not giving you any money. I am not co-signing any loans. I am not allowing you to borrow against my assets. Your financial problems are exactly that, your problems. Gary's face went white. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Yes, you are. And because you're my son, I'm going to give you some advice your father would have given you years ago if I had let him. Stop looking for easy money. Stop making investments you can't afford. Get a job that pays enough to cover your expenses, and learn to live within your means. A job? Mom, I'm 38 years old. I can't just get some entry-level position somewhere. Then you should have thought of that before you gambled away your future on cryptocurrency and restaurant franchises. Gary stood up abruptly, his desperation morphing into anger. This is ridiculous. You're not thinking clearly. Sandra was right. You're not competent to make these kinds of decisions anymore. There it is, I said quietly. The real plan. When I wouldn't voluntarily hand over my money, you were going to have me declared incompetent and take it anyway. That's not. I never said that. You just said it now. Sandra was right, I'm not competent. Were you planning to have me committed to Sunrise Manor, so you could liquidate my assets to pay your debts? Gary's silence was answer enough. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think you should leave now. Mom, please. You don't understand what you're doing. If I can't make these payments, we'll lose everything. Sandra will leave me. My credit will be ruined. I'll have nothing. Then you'll finally understand how I felt when you told that lawyer I already had one foot in the grave. Gary stood in my doorway, looking more defeated than I had ever seen him. So that's it? You're just going to let your own son lose everything? I'm not letting you do anything, Gary. I'm simply not rescuing you from the consequences of your own choices. There's a difference. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to find some other angle, some other way to manipulate me into solving his problems. Fine, he said finally. But don't expect me to keep pretending everything's okay between us. If you want to be selfish, if you want to abandon your own family when we need you most, then that's your choice. But don't expect Sandra and me to keep visiting, keep calling, keep pretending we're one big happy family. The threat was supposed to hurt me, supposed to make me realize what I would be losing if I did not give him what he wanted. But instead I felt only relief. I understand, I said. Goodbye, Gary. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to his car start and drive away. Then I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, feeling lighter than I had in years. The phone calls started the next day. First Sandra, sobbing about how I was destroying the family. Then Gary again, alternating between pleading and threats. Then Sandra's mother, whom I had not spoken to in 5 years, calling to tell me what a selfish person I had become. I blocked all their numbers and changed my home phone to an unlisted number. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from a collection agency, demanding payment on Gary's defaulted loan and listing me as a co-signer. I called Patricia immediately. They forged your signature, she said after reviewing the documents I brought to her office. This is fraud. Can they get away with it? Not if we fight it. But Geraldine, you need to understand this is going to get uglier before it gets better. They're not going to give up easily. I thought about Gary's desperate face, about Sandra's calculated smiles, about all the years I had enabled and excused and rescued them from their own poor choices. Let it get ugly, I said. I'm done being afraid of my own son. 6 months later, I was sitting on my back porch, watching the sunrise paint my garden in shades of gold and pink, when the phone rang. It was Patricia. The fraud charges have been dropped, she told me. Gary pled guilty to a lesser charge and agreed to make restitution for the forged loan documents. What kind of restitution? Community service and a formal apology. He won't serve jail time, but he'll have a criminal record now. I should have felt something, satisfaction, vindication, maybe even sadness for my son's fall from grace. Instead, I felt only a quiet sense of closure. What about the debts? That's his problem now. The court made it very clear that you bear no responsibility for his financial obligations. He can't use your name, forge your signature, or make any claims against your assets. After I hung up, I walked through my house, taking inventory of my new life. The spare bedroom that had once been Gary's was now my art studio, filled with watercolor supplies and half-finished paintings. The dining room table, where we used to have those tense family dinners, was covered with seed packets and gardening magazines as I planned this year's expansion of Harold's Rose Garden. The silence in my house was no longer empty, it was peaceful. I had not heard from Gary directly since that day he came begging for money, but news of his situation had filtered back through mutual acquaintances. He had been forced to declare bankruptcy. The house he and Sandra had worked so hard to acquire was gone, sold to pay creditors. Sandra had indeed left him, taking half of what little remained and moving back in with her parents. Gary was living in a one-bedroom apartment and working at a car dealership, the kind of job he had once considered beneath him. From what I heard, he was actually good at it, probably for the first time discovering the satisfaction that comes from earning something through honest work rather than manipulation. I felt no pleasure in his downfall, but I felt no guilt either. Gary was 48 years old enough to learn that actions have consequences, that other people are not responsible for fixing his mistakes. The most surprising development had come 3 months ago, when my neighbor Dorothy mentioned seeing a young woman at Gary's apartment. She seemed nice, Dorothy had said. Simple, you know? Not like Sandra with all her airs. This one looked like she actually cared about him, not just what he could do for her. I had nodded politely but felt no curiosity about Gary's new relationship. That chapter of my life was closed. My own life had opened up in ways I had never expected. Without the constant drain of Gary's financial emergencies and emotional manipulations, I had rediscovered interests I had set aside decades ago. The art classes I had always wanted to take. The book club at the library. The volunteer work at the animal shelter that filled my Tuesdays with purpose and joy. I had even started dating, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago when I was still grieving Harold and managing Gary's endless crises. Robert was a widower I had met at the book club, a gentle man who brought me flowers from his garden, and never once asked about my financial situation or suggested I needed help managing my affairs. "You seem different lately," he had told me just last week as we walked through the botanical gardens. Lighter somehow. He was right. I was lighter. I had released the weight of trying to fix people who did not want to be fixed, of loving people who saw that love as weakness to be exploited. This morning brought another small reminder of my freedom. A letter arrived from Sunrise Manor, the senior living facility Sandra had been so eager to move me into. They were following up on my interest in their community and wanted to schedule a tour. I threw the letter away without reading past the first paragraph. Instead, I made my coffee and went out to my garden, where Harold's roses were thriving under my renewed attention. This was my home, my sanctuary, my place of peace. No one was going to take it from me or convince me I was too old or too incompetent to enjoy it. As I worked among the roses, pulling weeds and deadheading spent blooms, I thought about the woman I had been a year ago. Afraid of disappointing Gary, afraid of being alone, afraid of standing up for myself because it might make things uncomfortable. That woman had been so busy trying to hold her family together that she had never stopped to ask whether it was worth holding together. She had confused enabling with love, manipulation with need, and her own guilt with responsibility. I was not that woman anymore. The irony was not lost on me that Gary's cruelest comment, that I already had one foot in the grave, had actually been what freed me to start living again. His casual dismissal of my life had forced me to examine what that life was worth, and I had discovered it was worth far more than I had been giving it credit for. My phone rang, interrupting my gardening. For a moment my heart clenched with the old anxiety. Was it Gary? Another crisis? Another emergency that required my immediate attention and financial intervention? But it was Robert, calling to confirm our dinner plans for that evening. We were going to try the new Italian restaurant downtown, then maybe take a walk by the river if the weather held. "I'm looking forward to it," I told him, and realized I meant it. When was the last time I had looked forward to anything? When had I last made plans that were just for my own enjoyment, with no thought of how they might inconvenience or disappoint someone else? After we hung up, I sat back on my heels in the garden dirt, feeling the sun warm on my shoulders. A year ago, I would have felt guilty about spending money on dinner out when Gary was struggling financially. I would have worried that enjoying myself was somehow disrespectful to Harold's memory or selfish in light of my family's problems. Now I understood that my happiness was not dependent on anyone else's approval or circumstances. I could grieve Harold's loss while still embracing new experiences. I could love my son while refusing to enable his destructive choices. I could be alone without being lonely, independent without being isolated. That evening, as Robert and I shared tiramisu and talked about the book we were both reading, I caught my reflection in the restaurant window. The woman looking back at me had laugh lines around her eyes and color in her cheeks. She looked confident, content, alive. She looked like someone who had both feet firmly planted in the present, with no intention of going anywhere anytime soon. Later that night, as I prepared for bed in my own house, in my own room, surrounded by my own things arranged exactly as I liked them, I thought about the twisted gift Gary had given me with his cruel words. He had meant to diminish me, to reduce me to an inconvenience standing between him and his inheritance. Instead, he had freed me from the prison of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it genuinely. I turned off the lights and settled into bed, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me. Tomorrow I would paint in my studio, tend my garden, maybe call Robert to see if he wanted to explore the farmer's market together. Tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that belonged to me. Gary had been wrong about one thing. I did not have one foot in the grave. I had both feet firmly planted in a life that was finally, authentically mine. And I intended to live every moment of it on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. The best revenge I had discovered was not revenge at all. It was simply living well, choosing joy, and refusing to let anyone else's limitations define my possibilities. In the darkness of my bedroom, I smiled. At 66, I was finally free to discover who I was when I was not trying to be who everyone else needed me to be. And that woman I was learning was someone worth knowing.